The view of religious language that prevails in the Catholic, Roman Catholic, and Protestant traditions, the Western Church, is that derived from Augustine. So I'm going to start with him. What Augustine proposes, not by way of religious language directly, has to do with how God possesses his attributes. And that's what influences his doctrine of religious language, or that doctrine which develops out of his position. And what he says about this is in De Trinitate, Book 7, sections 1 and 2, where he talks about Plato and the Platonists, who say that the highest form, the existence in which is the first form, unchangeable, they most rightly believed was the first principle of all things, which was not made and by which all things were made. And he identifies God, the creator of the Bible, with Plato's first form. I regard that as one of the most influential and perversive heresies ever to burden the Christian tradition. It's absolutely horrific to think that any Christian theologian would identify the creator of everything else, the uncreated creator, with an abstract, supposedly self-existent form of perfection. Identify God with a theory of a naturalist thinker who was not Christian, not even Jewish. That view was always rejected by the Eastern Church. In fact, they had written in warning against it before Augustine proposed it. Um, I'll give you one quote from an Eastern theologian, St. Basil of Caesarea, who said about this idea that God might be identical with perfections. Basil summed it up beautifully. He said, if there are perfections, God created them. That, after all, is how Genesis starts out. In the beginning, God created everything else. And it does not invite us then to identify any of the everything else with God. So the question is, how does God have the attributes that Scripture assigns to him? On the Greek, pagan, unchristian view adopted by Augustine, God is identical with those perfections. God just is the unity of all Plato's perfections. Every quality has a perfect instance, and so do all the necessary truths of logic and mathematics. They are all uncreated. And if they're true of God, they have to be uncreated, right? Because God is. So God is the being with all and only perfections. Of course, that's a Greek idea of perfection. The word perfection does occur in Scripture, seldom, but it does. But it has a Jewish meaning. The Jewish meaning is complete. It's the meaning we use when we say a newborn infant is perfect, has all its parts. It's complete. But the Greek meaning is an abstract quality in the infinite degree, a meaning no Bible writer could possibly have in mind when writing the word perfect. Now, opposed to that view is the Eastern Orthodox view, which was revived at the time of the Reformation by Calvin. The Eastern Orthodox are not known for being open and friendly, but they recognize that fact. In fact, one patriarch of Constantinople made a very expensive and dangerous trip from Constantinople to Geneva just to honor Calvin's memory. That was Cyril Lucaris, whom George Florovsky called the greatest of all the patriarchs. Anyway, Calvin held quite a different view. Calvin says this in the Institutes. Every perfection ascribed to God is found in creation, and hence is not God per se, but how God relates to us. The attributes that we know that are revealed to us have been created and taken on by God, taken into himself. I call this idea the idea of encreaturation. And Calvin held it everywhere that he wrote about it. In his commentary on Genesis, he says, when God walked and talked with Adam and Eve in the garden, those were pre-incarnation appearances of Christ. In other words, God had taken on human form in order to make himself known. So all the other attributes would be regarded the same way. God created that there is such a thing as mercy, justice, knowledge, power. In fact, that is what Scripture says about powers. It doesn't say God has all power. It says God created all the powers. So Calvin took this view and he held it thoroughly. He had never held anything else. Augustine immediately drew another consequence from this view of God's attributes, and that was that what he called the simplicity of God. Augustine says that the attributes that God has, every relation predicated of him is identical with every other. Because if it weren't, God would depend on the perfections. If God is not only self-existent, but an all-perfect being, then we would be forced to say there have to be perfections and God has to have them to be God. So then God would depend on them, but no, we can't say that. So we must say that God is identical with them. God is the unity of all the perfections. Of course, that makes God an abstract perfection. And abstract perfections can't do anything. Augustine says that the Platonists made that abstract form of all forms, the highest possible form, the creator, but that's not true. According to Plato, space and matter exist uncreated, and so do the forms. And then the forms, for what it is to be a tree, a house, a road, a human, influence matter which would otherwise be chaotic and produce imperfect copies of the perfect forms. But they don't create matter. And they don't bring those things like trees and roads and people, horses, into existence. The matter already exists. They just form it somehow. And Plato tried to explain that relation again and again and again and concluded that he couldn't. He was right about the conclusion. Since forms have no properties in common with matter, and matter has no properties in common with forms, there can be no relationship. It's a dead-end theory. Nevertheless, that's what Augustine bought into, the simplicity. So all the perfections are in God, the same perfection. And that's how we avoid making God dependent on the forms. He just is them, so he doesn't depend on them. And he says that too in De Trinitate 7, 1 and 2. All the perfections are equal or identical. And this does several disastrous things. One is that I've already mentioned, it makes God an abstract property, but it also makes language about God impossible. Now, Aquinas tried to get around this with his theory of analogical language, But it can't work, and I'll tell you why. Since these perfections in God are in the infinite mode, and according even to Aquinas, we don't know what the infinite modes are at all, then we don't know anything that's true about God. Second problem with it, we have those properties too. We have the property of being, at times at least, merciful, loving, just. And we have power. So, what does that say about us? It says that we are all partly God. Since those properties are uncreated in God, they have to be uncreated in us. The same property can't be created in God and uncreated in us. It can be infinite in God and finite and limited in us, but it's still the uncreated property that's the same in both, or our language doesn't mean the same when we talk about God at all. I haven't done an exhaustive study, but I have done a considerable study in Jewish and Muslim thinkers, and they recognize this as a severe problem. Maimonides concluded it couldn't be solved. How can God have the same property, any property that we have? How can we have any property that God has? If that's uncreated in God, it's uncreated in us. And that's an unacceptable pantheism. Of course, if all God's properties have been created by him and taken into himself, they constitute a nature of God that we can understand and share without pantheism. And that's precisely the position that the Eastern Orthodox Cappadocian fathers held and expounded in the 4th century. The last of them died in 397. Augustine died in 430. So they managed to say all of this, not in opposition to Augustine. They told what was wrong with that position before Augustine took it. There's another problem with identifying God with all and only perfections, and that is it creates what's called in theology the problem of evil. If God is perfectly just, that means he has infinite justice. He's obliged to be as just as possible to as many people and circumstances as is possible. Then why is there so much undeserved suffering in the world? Why do the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer? How could there be a Holocaust of God's own, aimed mainly at, but not exclusively, at God's own people? Well, that is quite a dance when you try to hear the replies to that. And the current uh, discussion is dominated by God has his reasons, we just don't know them. But if God is infinitely just, how could he have a reason for allowing injustice? You understand, the scripture never says God is infinitely just. God deals with humans in covenants, and God specifies the conditions of those covenants. God offers his love, forgiveness, everlasting life, and he promises to be perfectly just with us. He never promised to see to it that everyone else would be too. That's an invention of the perfections view of God. Nowhere to be found in Scripture, and indeed, much of Scripture is inconsistent with it, but Protestant and Catholic theology ignores that. So we get Aquinas analogical theory. There's some kind of analogy. There's a likeness between what we possess and what God possesses, but they're not identical. I find that position to end in self-contradiction. Two things can be alike if and only if they share some property. They would have minimally to share the property of being alike, wouldn't they? And any property they share is either uncreated because it's possessed by God, or created because it's possessed by us, but the same property can't be both. You see, we're edging now toward whether our language about God can make sense. And this is the way it comes out. I claim there can't be an analogy because then there would have to be a common property. And their claim is there are no common properties. That's how we avoid saying that the same thing is created and uncreated. Opposed to that, what Scripture suggests in more than one place, I've used too weak a word, what Scripture says in more than one place, is that God created properties and took them into himself. And that begins in Proverbs chapter 8, where wisdom, speaking of herself, says, I was the first of God's creations. He brought me forth before the heavens and earth. And then wisdom goes on to say that she was with him in the creation of the heavens and the earth. And that chapter ends with, and then I was with the children of men. So here's a chapter of scripture that explicitly says that God created wisdom and then used it, took it on, made it true of himself. Augustine says, oh, but this couldn't mean the wisdom of God, because then he wouldn't have been eternally wise. In other words, his argument is in a circle. He assumes God has to have all perfections, and therefore he'd have to have this one. Instead, what Scripture then gives us is God's accommodating himself to us so that we can understand him. Think about another example of this same point. We're told in the opening of the Scripture, God created everything else. So God's the uncreated creator, and everything else is his creation. That requires us to say that prior to creating, or aside from creating, if you don't like the temporal term, God didn't have the property of being the creator. But that once he created the world, he stood in relation of being in the relation of being its creator. So he created that relation too. Being the creator of was brought into existence by God, simultaneous with his creating something other than himself. And that's true of God, but not of his uncreated originating being, which is independent of all else. And of course, we have this doctrine in the New Testament under the name incarnation. God took the whole created person of Jesus Christ into himself. Jews and Muslims have always rejected that, which is why they can't have an account of religious language. But encreaturation gives us an account. In the incarnation, God took the created human Jesus into himself, and Jesus became the human side of God, and God became the divine side of Jesus Christ. Jews and Muslims have always said that violates the creator-creature distinction. You've fudged everything. But that's not true. St. Athanasius put it this way: it is not that in the incarnation our humanity became divine, but that the divine took our humanity into himself. I'll now say it better. I have another point to make, and that is that in trying to save religious language by a theory of analogy, of it, Aquinas called it the theory of proper proportionality. He either leaves it that God and humans have a common property, have common properties, in which case they can't be both uncreated and created. And some more contemporary writers say, no, there's nothing in common. And if there isn't, then whatever God has is not what we're talking about when we use the words like love, justice, mercy, forgiveness, and so on. In thinking about that, Aquinas elsewhere, when he's not talking about religious language, makes this point, and I'm quoting him now. This is Summa Theologica 1a, 13, section 7. It is clear that while creatures are really related to God, in God there is no real relation to creatures, but only a logical one. Attribution of terms implying a relation in time denote change in creatures, not in him. That undercuts 100% of the gospel. God has no real relation to creatures? I think at that point Aquinas realized that if he said it did, either we would be partly uncreated or something about God would be created. And thinking that the second is unthinkable and that the first is unthinkable, he denied there's any relation at all. I take it when he says except a logical one, he means that God is logically distinct from us. We're not the same thing. I can't think of a bigger mishmash and a more total denial of everything about the gospel. This means God takes no initiatives. It's not the case that God loved the world and gave his only son to redeem it. God can't do anything because God's an abstract property, changeless. And he can't relate to anything else, no real relation. And that's because he's already assuming that God has to have all the perfections and he can't have anything else. Remember, Plato's view was that the realm of forms contained all and only perfections. So if God contains only perfections, how could he relate to creatures? Those aren't perfect. Those relations wouldn't be perfect. Instead of putting Plato in the trash can where he belongs and listening to what scripture actually does say, namely that God will never be unjust to us, but never promised that he'd see to it that everyone else was too, what ancient Jew or modern wouldn't fall on the floor laughing at that idea? Laughing bitter tears. We all wish it were true, but it's not, and God never promised it. And while we have every right to hold God to his covenant promises, we don't have any right to add to them, especially not a bogus theory like Plato's that never worked from the beginning. Well, I'm sorry if this account includes a bit of a rant, but I've worked with this so long and become so fed up with it that it's hard to know what to say. Beyond that, the idea of encreaturation works. It's God's accommodation to him, to us. In order for us to know God, he has to take on characteristics and reveal what they are. Two conditions. He has to accommodate himself to us by encreaturation, and he has to reveal what that is for us to know it. And we don't have any right adding to that, especially not a bogus theory of perfections.